People who quit their jobs on the first day, what was your I'm out of here moment? Story 1. When I was about 20 years old, I got hired as a temporary floor associate at Forever 21 during the holiday season. My training started a week before Black Friday, so the store was already in a state of chaos. On my first day, the floor manager gathered all the new hires, gave us a tour of the store, and explained the layout. Afterward, I was assigned to shadow a veteran floor associate to get a sense of my responsibilities. As soon as this assignment was made, the manager disappeared, and I didn't see her again. About an hour and a half into my shift, the person I was shadowing received an emergency family call and had to take the rest of the week off. Left in this situation, I approached another floor manager, explained what had happened, and asked who I should shadow instead. The manager's response was, "Just do what you can by yourself. You'll be fine. Everyone else is busy." I figured, well, okay, I'll give it a try. If you've ever shopped in the women's section of Forever 21 during a seasonal sale, you'll know they often have multiple articles of clothing that look almost identical, but with slight differences. For example, there might be a white cardigan with 4 buttons that looks nearly the same as another white cardigan with 5 buttons. To make matters worse, these similar items were often placed in completely separate areas of the store. The dressing room staff was responsible for returning unpurchased items to their respective sections, but they didn't seem to care much about accuracy. Since I didn't know whether certain items belonged in my section or not, I'd waste a lot of time searching for the right spot, only to eventually realize this isn't even my section. I've checked every rack. At that point, I'd just place the item back on the sorting rack and move on to the next one. To my frustration, more than half the items I was tasked with reshelving didn't belong in my section at all. I just did the best I could and prepared myself for another miserable day. The next day, I arrived at work only to be pulled aside by the store manager. She told me I was too slow the previous day and that if I wanted to keep my job, I needed to work much faster. I tried explaining my lack of training and how unfamiliar I was with the layout of the store, but her response was to suggest I come in during my free time to memorize where everything was. I spent the rest of that shift putting clothes in random places out of sheer frustration and decided never to return for a third shift. Story 2. When I was hired, they explained that we had to wear fashionable clothing, and sneakers or any comfortable shoes were strictly prohibited. I asked what they expected me to wear on concrete floors for 10-hour shifts, and the manager bluntly said, "Heels, flats, sandals, or boots. Heels are preferred." I opted for combat boots or flats, but even then I ended up with terrible blisters. They never taught me where specific clothes went, so I had to rely on guesswork based on the tags or whether an item looked similar to something already on a rack. When I asked if someone could train me, they laughed and told me to come back during my free time to shop and learn the layout. It's funny how this seems to be the same logic they gave to others. The worst part was closing the store. The mall closed at 9 p.m., but I sometimes didn't get home until 3 a.m. because even if you finished your section, you weren't allowed to leave until everyone else was done. I'd finish my work only to be forced to help coworkers who had been slacking off all day. To make things worse, they made us clock out before midnight and clock back in at 12:01 a.m. to avoid paying overtime. At the time, I didn't realize how badly I was being taken advantage of. The last straw came when my mom had a cancer scare, and I needed to go to the hospital to see her. When I told my manager, she coldly responded, "She won't die in the next 8 hours. You can deal with her in your own time." The way she said it, as though my mom was an inconvenience, completely broke me. I told her off, threw my lanyard at her, and walked out. I haven't shopped there since. Story 3. My first internship was at a Brazilian teen detention center. It's similar to a prison, but Brazilian law treats crimes committed by teenagers differently than those committed by adults. Instead of traditional incarceration, teens undergo socio-educational measures. One day, I was walking through the courtyard with my supervisor when chaos erupted. Doctors were running and waving their arms, shouting, while officers came sprinting from the opposite direction. My supervisor grabbed me and told me to run back to the office. It turned out that a group of teens, some as young as 12, had escaped their block. A few minutes later, an officer came pounding on our office door, yelling for everyone to evacuate because a fire had broken out. Apparently, some of the teens had set mattresses on fire inside their cells. I didn't quit right away, but my teacher, who wasn't even present that day, decided the environment was too dangerous for me. The university forced me to find another internship. Oh well. Story 4. I worked as a cashier at Lowe's during college, but for less than one full day. I made it through the multi-day training process, but there was so much chaos that I genuinely wondered if I was on a hidden camera show. The existing employees constantly complained about how hard they worked while still not getting enough hours. No one understood why the store was hiring 4 new people. I was one of the 4. It turns out this was related to a sexual harassment complaint that required store restructuring and the firing of certain employees. This situation was explained to the new hires, despite it being against company policy, but was not known to the rest of the staff. Some of the people still working there were directly involved, including one of the employees responsible for our training. That trainer had a questionable approach, to say the least. She dismissed the harassment complaint, saying it wasn't a big deal and that everything would go back to normal soon. She even implied we shouldn't be so uptight about the issue. Ironically, she was fired the day before I officially started, along with one of the cashiers who had helped train me. She also gave me terrible advice during the application process. I told her I could work nights most days, but if they needed daytime help, it had to be on my school-free days. She warned me not to be too restrictive, lied to my boss about my availability to make me seem more appealing, and suggested I schmooze a bit to get ahead. She promised none of this would impact my schedule. It was all lies. My first week's schedule had me working mornings every day I had school and gave me no hours on my free days. Not only that, but they assigned me twice the hours the position originally called for, even as other employees were being shorted. The schedule was completely incompatible with my school commitments. I only went in on my first day to quit and explain how messy the application process was. They couldn't figure out how everything had gone so wrong until they asked who trained me. Suddenly, it all made sense. They thanked me for at least showing up to formally quit, unlike the other 3 new hires, who simply stopped answering calls and no-showed on their first days. Story 5. A long time ago, shortly after earning my qualifications as a chef, I had an interview at a hotel for a kitchen position. The executive chef and I chatted in his office for about 20 minutes. I remember him coming across as very arrogant, something that's unfortunately common in this field. At the time, I didn't think much of it because the pay was decent, and the shifts fit what I wanted. As I was leaving his office, I started heading back through the dining room, the same way I had come in. The dining room was closed at the time, with another hour or so before service began. As I turned, he said, "No, not that way. Go through the kitchen. You're not good enough to go through the dining room." I was so taken aback by his comment that I didn't even respond. I simply did as he asked and left. Later, after I got home, I called him and said, "After taking a closer look, I've decided your menu isn't good enough for me to accept your offer." Story 6. My first job was when I was 13 delivering phone books from the back of a van. My job was to take the books to people's letterboxes while an older guy drove the van slowly down the street. At one point, after we'd finished deliveries on one street, the van was nearly empty, so there was more space to move around in the back. As he drove to the next location, he was driving quite aggressively, and I lost my balance and fell inside the back of the van. There were no seats in the back, so as I tried to steady myself, I accidentally placed my hand on a portable radio with a broken razor-sharp antenna. The antenna sliced the palm of my hand open, leaving a gruesome wound about 3-4 inches long. I immediately told the driver to pull over because I needed help. He looked at my hand, handed me a plastic bag, the kind you'd get at a supermarket, and told me to wrap my hand with it. Then, he just continued the deliveries himself. I should have been taken to a hospital or at least back home to my parents, but he didn't even consider it. I quit that day and never returned. As you can imagine, my parents were furious when they found out. Story 7. When I was 18, I got hired at a tiny knockoff dollar store in an old struggling mall. The owner, who spoke with a very thick accent, told me I'd be paid $6 an hour but didn't mention that the job was under the table. My first task was to stock the overly cluttered shelves, which I did for about an hour before being told to get more chips from the storage area in the back. When I went back there, I found about a dozen men sitting on boxes crammed into a small, dimly lit room. When I asked where the chips were, they all glared at me and started speaking rapidly in another language, while motioning toward me. One man eventually stood up, retrieved a box of chips, and handed it to me. The entire time I felt deeply uncomfortable as they all continued to stare at me. Later, I needed to use the restroom, which was also in the back. As I walked toward the women's restroom, they just silently watched me. While I was in the restroom, someone tried to open the door, even though I was the only woman there. To make things even worse, the owner told me he wanted me to come back late that night, well after the mall had closed. I didn't return that evening. The next morning, I came in and lied about why I couldn't work there anymore. He gave me a few dollars for the time I had worked and didn't ask questions. To this day, I have no idea what was going on in that store, and honestly, I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. Story 8. I worked as the only waitress at a newly opened diner. The boss didn't have me sign any paperwork. Everything was under the table. However, that wasn't what ultimately made me quit by the end of my first night. Instead of simply calling me over when he needed me, the boss had a disturbing habit of pinching my skirt at my upper thigh. Not quite at my butt, but uncomfortably close, and pulling me in whatever direction he wanted me to go, as if it were a leash. If he needed me in the kitchen, he'd come out, grab my skirt, and pull me there. If he wanted me at the cash register, he'd grab my skirt and lead me to it. This behavior was not only humiliating for me, but also made some of the customers visibly uncomfortable. One couple even left me an almost 50% tip, but I suspect it was out of pity. By the end of the night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called him that evening and told him the job wasn't for me. A few days later, I returned to turn in my apron, and he casually pulled a wad of cash from his pocket to pay me. I'm certain quitting was the smartest decision I could have made. He was creepy beyond belief. Story 9. I've worked in construction jobs my whole life, and the number of angry, abusive people I've encountered is endless. However, one particular person from the 1990s still holds the title for the worst boss I've ever met. A friend of mine quit his job and, without telling me, gave my number to his awful boss. One day, this guy called me out of the blue and asked if I needed work. I said I did, and he said he could pick me up the next morning. I told him I had my own car and could meet him on site, but he yelled, "No, I'll pick you up." I was shocked that he was yelling at me 2 minutes into the conversation. Reluctantly, I gave him my address, and he said he'd be there at 6:30 a.m. At 5:30 the next morning, he called shouting, "Where the heck is your house?" No greeting, no good morning, just screaming. I told him to stop yelling so I could give him directions, but he kept going, so I hung up. He immediately called back, furious that I had hung up on him. I told him to leave me alone and not bother showing up. Unfortunately, his phone call woke up my 2 roommates, who weren't too happy with me. I explained what had happened, and they went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, I was jolted awake again by the sound of a car horn blaring outside. We lived on a farm, so thankfully, our closest neighbor was half a mile away. My roommates were livid as we all went outside to see what was going on. The boss was in his truck, yelling at us to get in because we were late, even though he had arrived 30 minutes earlier than agreed. He didn't even know who I was. My friend, seeing an opportunity, walked up to him and demanded to be paid up front. The boss launched into a tirade, but my friend just laughed in his face and said he wouldn't work unless he was paid first. The guy kept yelling, so we all went back inside the house. From the window, we watched as he sat in his truck for a while, honking the horn again. Eventually, he came to bang on the door. I opened the door and he turned out to be about 5'2" and 200 pounds, a comical sight. He started to say something, but I cut him off. "Didn't I tell you to leave and not come back?" He looked confused and asked where the other guy was. I told him my friend was just messing with him and that I was the person he had spoken to. I added, "Now get off my property." He started yelling again, so I slammed the door in his face. When he started banging on the door like a lunatic, I grabbed a hockey stick and chased him back to his truck. Watching him run was pretty funny. He drove off, threatening to get me back for this, but to this day, he remains the biggest jerk I've ever met. Story 10. I got a job at a Build-A-Bear knockoff in a mostly empty mall. My interview with the owners, an older couple, was unusual. They mentioned that they had originally wanted to open a Chick-fil-A, but couldn't afford the $1 million startup cost, so they decided on this store instead. On my first day, one other employee was working, but she didn't say much to me and disappeared into the back shortly after I arrived. I was left standing under a giant storybook-themed mushroom that served as the register area. A mother and her young son walked in, so I greeted them and let them browse. After a few minutes, they left. My coworker then came out from the back holding a cordless phone and handed it to me. It was the owner. He told me that whenever a customer walked in, I needed to come out from under the mushroom to greet them. He repeated this several times. "Come out from the mushroom." After he hung up, I asked my coworker about the phone call. She explained that the store had cameras and the owners watched them from their home, frequently calling to give instructions. That was enough for me. I didn't go back to work after that day. Story 11. In 2002, I was hired as a cook at a country club in Miami, Florida. It turned out to be the grossest kitchen I've ever worked in while in the United States, and I've seen some bad ones around the world. Most of the food in the coolers was rotting. There were ants crawling on the cutting board I was assigned to use. The person training me casually grabbed a dirty towel off the floor to brush the ants aside so I could work. Food that should have been refrigerated was left out, and the walk-in freezer door couldn't close properly because of excessive ice buildup. I felt nauseous the entire time I was there. Somehow, I made it through the day but decided not to return for my second shift. When the chef called me to ask why, I told him outright that I wouldn't come back. He threatened to call my culinary school and report that I had walked out on him. I told him that was fine, and then I called the health department to report the kitchen's practices. A year later, the health department followed up on my claim, but it took them that long to investigate. Regardless, I stand by my decision to quit without notice and report them. Story 12. When I was 20, I worked at Wendy's. As far as fast food jobs go, it wasn't bad. Wanting to earn extra cash, I decided to take on a second job. Having washed dishes in a busy restaurant during high school, I applied for a dishwasher position at a local IHOP and was hired. My first night was a graveyard shift scheduled to end at 3 a.m. I knew it would be tough since I had to clock in at Wendy's by 9 a.m., but I figured I could manage with a few hours of sleep. Unfortunately, 3 a.m. came and went, and the person scheduled to relieve me never showed up. I ended up working until 6 a.m. By the time I got home, there was no point in sleeping, so I stayed awake and went straight to Wendy's for my morning shift. I was lucky I didn't fall asleep at the wheel. After getting some rest later that evening, I went back to IHOP and quit. I decided my health and safety were more important than extra cash, and I've never regretted that decision. Story 13. My friend and I got jobs at a Maytag assembly plant building ovens and stoves. My role was on the assembly line, clipping wires to stovetops. After 8 hours, I could no longer close my hand due to exhaustion. During a scheduled break, I approached the line supervisor and explained that I couldn't continue because my manual dexterity was gone. I said I was willing to come back the next day and keep working to build up my stamina, but for the remainder of the day, I needed to swap positions with someone else on the line. My friend, who overheard, even offered to switch spots with me. The supervisor refused, so I told her I had no choice but to quit. My friend, realizing he wouldn't have a ride if I left, decided to quit too. We walked out together. Apparently, the company would rather lose 2 workers than let someone switch tasks to adjust to the demands of the job. Story 14. I worked as a social worker in an outpatient mental health program. Typically, the first day involves paperwork and registering with the county to provide services. However, my first day was far from typical. They thought it would be a good idea for me to shadow someone and observe the type of work I'd be doing. Within the first 4 hours, we were called out to several crisis interventions. One of these involved a man who had been using a significant amount of crystal meth and had been off his medication for a week. His room and board care home called us to report that he had just returned after being missing for several days. When we arrived, the man was standing in the driveway as though he had been waiting for us. As we tried to de-escalate the situation, it became clear that he was responding to internal stimuli. Suddenly, he pulled out a razor blade and began cutting off his genitals. The scene that unfolded was horrific. Blood everywhere, screams echoing, and it became clear to me that I wasn't cut out for this type of work. That day was enough to make me realize that I would be better suited to working in an inpatient setting. While I love my job, I don't think I'll ever get over the trauma of witnessing that incident. Story 15. I worked at Kohl's for a brief period, and it was a disaster from the start. The hiring process was chaotic. A group of us spent an entire day just trying to complete paperwork. It was a red flag, but I'd been unemployed for 7 months and really needed the job. On my first official day, I spent the first half of my shift watching training videos. The constant emphasis on how I must push the store credit card or risk being fired filled me with dread. They stressed that if I didn't get enough signups each month, I'd lose my job. I mentally checked out but convinced myself to stick it out and try to transfer out of cashier duties as soon as possible. After lunch, I began register training. The day was painfully slow, and my trainer left an hour into my shift, leaving me mostly on my own. Occasionally, someone would walk by to check in, but I was essentially left to fend for myself. After my shift, I tried to speak to the manager about my schedule. I had received another job offer and wanted to see if I could balance both. The manager wasn't there, but later left me an angry voicemail ranting that I couldn't work a second job unless it accommodated their 39.5-hour schedule. She also forbade me from working nights for the other company, even though I was scheduled only for mornings that week. The next day, I dropped a resignation notice on her desk and walked out. Kohl's is nothing but a company of whip-cracking managers obsessed with credit cards. I'm glad I left. Story 16. I was hired as a hearse driver, or so I thought. The job ad and interview made it clear my only responsibility would be to drive the hearse to and from funerals. The first red flag came during the interview when I was told I'd be on call 24/7. That struck me as odd because funerals are usually scheduled days in advance, but I didn't question it at the time. On my first day, my boss called and told me to pick up the hearse and meet him at a house. I thought this was strange, but assumed the body had already been prepared and I'd simply be transporting it to the funeral home. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived, the police and the deceased's family were outside and the front door was open. From the hearse, I could smell the unmistakable stench of death. My boss greeted me with, "I'm so sorry, man. If I knew it was going to be like this, I wouldn't have made this your first call. I've never seen one like this." No hello, just a grim warning. It turned out I wasn't just driving the hearse, I was also helping to remove the body from the house. I hadn't signed up for that, but with the police and family watching, I felt pressured to proceed. The house was beyond filthy, worse than anything you'd see on Hoarders. The deceased had suffered a heart attack at the top of the stairs, fallen down and died at the bottom. His body had been there for 4 days before the family found him. To make matters worse, the body was around 350 pounds and too stiff to fit on a gurney. We had to carry it out in a sheet. During the process, my glove ripped. A police officer handed me a replacement, and thank goodness, because as I adjusted the sheet on the other side of the body, my hand came out covered in diarrhea. I had to fight the urge to vomit. After we finally loaded the body into the hearse, I thought I was done. Wrong again. At the funeral home, I had to prepare the body for the mortician. This involved stripping it naked, which only added to the nausea and trauma. When I finally got home, I sat in silence for an hour, staring at the wall. The next day, I quit. For all that, I was paid just $62. At 18 years old, that experience haunted me. I eventually sought counseling, and now I clean carpets and air ducts for a living. Life is a lot better now. Story 17. I applied to do transcription work for a company that seemed great on paper. They were enthusiastic about hiring me, but said they needed to do a test run first to assess my skills. They assured me I would be paid for my work. No problem. I had a few years of experience transcribing and preparing documents for an attorney, so the work sounded very similar. What they sent me, however, was a poorly recorded audio file. The speaker had a thick accent, and there was microphone feedback that made it nearly impossible to understand anything. The file was also over half an hour long, much more than the 15 minutes they had initially promised. I transcribed 15 minutes per their original instructions and sent it back. Half an hour later, I received the transcript back, marked up with corrections. The issue? The errors weren't mine, they were theirs. Punctuation was wrong, and some content they claimed was incorrect was actually what I clearly heard on the audio. Along with the feedback, they attached a contract stating that for every error they found, 25 cents would be deducted from my invoice. It also included a clause stating I agreed never to badmouth the company. I blocked them immediately and ignored their repeated attempts to contact me over the next few days. Every time they tried reaching out, I blocked them again until they gave up. It was clearly a con job, and I'm glad I recognized it before wasting any more time. Story 18. One summer in college, I got a job delivering products for a shady charity. They used high-pressure telemarketing tactics to sell random items over the phone, and my job was to deliver the goods and collect the payment. The catch? I only got paid when I successfully collected the money. Looking back, I'm sure they donated the bare minimum to qualify as a charity. The first day was okay. People weren't thrilled to see me, and many didn't answer their doors or pretended not to be home. Still, I made a little money. The second day, however, was a disaster. I drove over 100 miles, nearly got my car stuck in the woods, and cleared only $20 by the end of the day. At one point, I watched 2 men jump out of their cars and start fighting in the middle of the road. Combined with my growing suspicions about the legitimacy of the business, I decided I was done. That evening, I called to quit. Surprisingly, they were understanding. They made a soft attempt to convince me to stay, but it was clear I wasn't the first to walk away after a day or two. I had thought that driving around outside would be a fun summer job, but after that experience, I went straight to Walmart for a steady paycheck. Story 19. I was a laboratory scientist starting a new position, and on my second day, I was being trained to assist with bone marrow processing after an aspiration procedure. I had experience with this, but I still needed to learn the specific procedures at this facility. If you've never seen a bone marrow aspiration, it's an intense and invasive procedure. The doctor locates the patient's hip bone, posterior iliac crest, injects lidocaine to numb the area, and then uses a large bore needle to access the bone marrow. It's typically done by a trained pathologist or surgeon and is relatively routine. However, at this hospital, the procedure was being performed by a radiologist. That was unusual, but not necessarily a problem. The real issue started when we were told to leave the imaging room mid-procedure, so a CT scan could be taken to see how close the needle was to the bone. This completely broke the sterile field. After multiple attempts and several CT scans, the needle finally reached the bone. The patient was sedated, which is uncommon for this type of procedure, but they managed to finish. My trainer and I were both uncomfortable with how irregular the process was. When we voiced our concerns to the lead pathologist, we were told to keep our heads down and not question how other doctors did their jobs. That was the final straw for me. I wasn't willing to work in a place where unethical practices were swept under the rug. I quit the next morning. That hospital closed a few years later. Story 20. Fresh out of college, I was thrilled to land my first engineering job. During the interview, I was told I'd be working on civil projects, redlining blueprints, and handling basic tasks for entry-level engineers. It sounded perfect. On my first day, I quickly realized things were off. They didn't have office space for me and stuck me at someone else's desk. I was told I'd be moved again the next day to another desk. While annoying, it wasn't a deal breaker. The real issue came when they handed me a stack of secretarial tasks: inputting client data, answering phones, organizing spreadsheets, and transferring company files. When I asked when I'd start working on the engineering projects I was hired for, they said it might be a few weeks. They claimed the office needed to be organized before I could start. At lunch, I called my recruiter and told him I wouldn't be returning. To my surprise, he agreed with me and said he was shocked they had done that. Not long after, the company shut down. Luckily, I found a new position with an amazing boss, a higher salary, and my own office. It all worked out in the end. Story 21. I lasted 1 week working for the company that manages hotels inside America's national parks. My assignment was in Yellowstone, and while I didn't expect luxury accommodations, the living conditions were worse than I could have imagined. I was crammed into a 60-year-old shack with 20-plus other women. Signs warning about hantavirus and lead poisoning were everywhere, and the building's age made me wonder how it was still standing. The J1 students staying there partied nonstop, getting drunk and running through the shack screaming at all hours. Despite this, no one enforced any rules or held them accountable. The final straw came after a late shift. Around 11 p.m., I was walking from one lodge to another in complete darkness, with only nature around. When I reached a parking lot, I accidentally walked into a trailer hitch on someone's car. I still have a scar and an indent on my shin from that, and I somehow managed to slice my thumb diagonally as well. By the time I made it back to the shack, blood was pouring down my leg and hand. While talking with my roommate about what to do, the resident assistant burst in and started yelling at us for being too loud during quiet hours, completely ignoring the fact that I was bleeding. The next morning, I packed up my car, told him to shove it, and drove 14 hours back home. Story 22. I got hired at a small, family-owned winery run by a mother and son. Looking back, I should have walked out on my first day. The son constantly spoke to his mother, who was incredibly sweet, like she was a dog. When I dropped off my resume, the employee working the tasting room was visibly drunk. That should have been my second clue. A few days into training, they assigned me to a tiny kitchenette separate from the tasting room. It was so small that only one person could fit at a time. My job was to prepare bread, meat, and cheese plates, run the orders out to guests, clean the dishes, and restock supplies, all by myself. One slow day, I put on some music while cleaning dishes, keeping the sink running to rinse them off. The son walked in, saw the water running for a few seconds, and launched into a tirade. He lectured me about wasting water, how high water bills were, and how leaving the sink running made him want to choke someone out. He also said I'd never succeed in life if I didn't know how to wash dishes properly. I left in the middle of their next busy day and never looked back. No job is worth that level of disrespect. Story 23. I worked at a Hanes factory for one day. When I arrived, the woman at the desk had me fill out paperwork and told me to wait for the manager to come get me. While waiting, I watched at least 5 people storm out, quitting in anger. Eventually, about 10 of us were called into a large, empty room to fill out more paperwork and go over safety guidelines. Then, The manager split us into groups based on the jobs we'd applied for. I had applied for a position involving freight movement, using pallet jacks and forklifts to load shipping trucks. But at the last second, the manager reassigned me without any discussion. My new task? Pricing and folding Champion brand clothing in a sweatshop-like environment. The shift was 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with only 3 days off allowed per year. We got one break, but everyone had to stand in line to check in at the break room. If you were at the back of the line, you had no time to eat or rest. Food and drinks were prohibited on the work floor, and they threatened write-ups for retrieving anything from your vehicle. I had left my lunch in my truck, so I went the whole day without eating. There was no training, and leaving your station for help was against the rules. When I told someone in charge that I didn't know what I was doing because it wasn't the job I applied for, they ignored me. When I tried to quit, they cut me off mid-sentence with a dismissive, "Have a nice day," and walked away. I didn't go back. Now I work at a small local gas station kitchen making burgers and fries. I love my coworkers and customers, and I'm grateful I left that factory. Story 24. On my first day at a new job, my boss stormed into the office, barely acknowledged me, and immediately began screaming at his wife, who was standing in my office welcoming me. He even called her a useless expletive. I was completely speechless. He then gathered the entire staff into his office for a meeting. For 3.5 hours, he berated everyone, complained about millennials, and ranted about his pet peeves. He had bulging, intense eyes and a look of pure malice. It was unsettling. The meeting accomplished absolutely nothing except making everyone feel small. I hadn't met him in person prior to that day, as the interview had been over Zoom, but being in the same room with him gave me chills. After the meeting, I asked a coworker, who looked completely drained, if the day had been typical. She stared at me with dead eyes and said, "Sometimes it's worse." The rest of the day was more of the same. He screamed abusive language at his wife from his office and called me in for a one-on-one meeting where he was condescending and dismissive. He laughed at me in a way that felt deliberately cruel and seemed to take pleasure in making me feel stupid. I left work with a gut feeling that he was dangerous. That night, I cried to my husband and wrote my resignation letter. The next morning, I calmly handed it to my boss and said the position wasn't the right fit. His reaction was terrifying. He went into a psychotic rage, yelling about the money he had wasted on my business cards and calling me disgusting. I genuinely thought he wanted to hit me. I was shaking by the time it was over. Dodged a bullet with that one. That place felt like hell. Story 25. I was hired as a pastry chef at a bakery. My interview was at the corporate office, so I hadn't met the head chef, my direct boss, until my first day. When I walked into the kitchen, the head chef scoffed and said, "Oh, you're a girl?" He then went on to explain that he didn't think women were cut out to be pastry chefs. Later, he asked me to stay an extra 5 hours. I told him I needed to make a quick phone call to ensure everything was okay at home, and he launched into a 40-minute rant. He told me I was lucky to work for him because he was an award-winning baker who had once owned his own bakery. He also said that if this job wasn't my top priority, it wasn't going to work out. As I was leaving to take my lunch break, he informed me that he had called the corporate office to report how awful I was. He said my $17/hour rate was being reduced to $12/hour for a 6-week probationary period, while he retrained me to his standards. After that, he said I could earn back a raise to $14/hour. I left during my break and never returned. The corporate office called to apologize and admitted they had hoped I could replace the head chef because the rest of the staff had walked out on him a few weeks earlier. I told them there was no way I could work under such a toxic person for 6 weeks. 6 months later, I drove by the bakery and saw that it had closed. As for me, I'm now the lead baker at a successful bakery with an all-women team. Take that, Edwin, and your women can't bake attitude. Story 26. On my first day at a new job, my boss immediately started commenting on my body and appearance. I was wearing mid-thigh shorts and a blouse, as I'd been told I'd only be doing computer training and wasn't given a specific dress code. It was 100 degrees outside, so I chose something modest but comfortable. She shamed me for my appearance, accusing me of showing off and implying I was overdressed. When she asked what size uniform shirt I needed, she looked me up and down and said, "You need an extra large, right?" In a condescending tone, I corrected her, saying I usually wore a medium or large, but she handed me an extra large anyway. Then she tried setting up the computer for my training, but the keyboard wasn't working. Instead of solving the issue herself, she asked if I could go home and bring back a keyboard from my house. I was baffled by the lack of professionalism. I left shortly after and later called to let her know I was no longer interested in the position. It was one of the most unprofessional experiences I've ever had. Story 27. My first day as a makeup artist at a boudoir photography studio turned out to be my last. I was supposed to work an 8-hour day doing makeup for several clients, but the red flags started popping up immediately. The first issue was the makeup station. It was filthy, and the studio had very few products and no proper disposables. While I had brought my own brushes, I was required to use their house makeup, which was completely unhygienic. I did my best to stay as clean and professional as possible for the clients. The second issue was that no time was scheduled for lunch breaks. I had brought food, anticipating a break, but never got the chance to eat. Working on an empty stomach made the day much harder to endure. The third red flag was the studio's employees. They openly insulted their clients, calling them ugly or fat, and complaining that they never got hot girls for their shoots. They also discriminated against sex workers, refusing to serve them. The final straw came at the end of the day. The 2 employees I was working with insisted on saying a prayer together before we left, leaving me standing there awkwardly. While I respect others' beliefs, I found it strange and unprofessional to do this in front of a new employee. The next day, I told them it wasn't a good fit and declined to return. Story 28. Technically, I lasted 2 weeks, but it was the first job I ever walked away from mid-assignment. I'm a travel nurse, and during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, I took a position in Orange County, expecting to work in the ICU. However, when I arrived, they reassigned me to their step-down unit without warning. They assured me the pay would be the same. The nurse-to-patient ratio wouldn't exceed 1:3, and I wouldn't float to lower acuity units. Day 1 was a nightmare. The facility was tiny, yet there were over 80 travel nurses working there. Red flag number 1. I met the new manager, as the one who hired me had quit suddenly. Red flag number 2. Then the manager casually announced that the current nurse-to-patient ratio was 1:5. Red flag number 3. Despite my misgivings, I tried to stick it out, but it only got worse. The hospital had no core staff. They had all quit, leaving only overwhelmed new grads and Filipino nurses locked into long-term contracts. Critical COVID patients weren't on central monitors, meaning I had to physically check on them every hour to ensure they were alive. An impossible task. Supplies were non-existent. There was only one working thermometer for the entire unit, and the charting system was awful. By the second week, most of the travelers who started with me had already quit. One day, they tried to assign me 8 patients. That same day, the charge nurse quit mid-shift, leaving without a word. I called my recruiter and told them I was done. I found another hospital down the road with no staffing issues and quickly learned my previous facility had a terrible reputation, even before the pandemic. Locals called it Fatal Valley, a nickname that rhymes with its real name. Story 29. I'm a lab tech with over a decade of experience, and I'm good at what I do. I took a new job closer to home, despite a $9/hour pay cut, hoping it would be worth it. It wasn't. The hospital had 175 beds, but I was the only phlebotomist on staff. My day consisted of running from the ICU to labor and delivery to the OR, handling everything on my own. I barely had time to figure out the layout of the hospital, and their outdated systems only made things harder. I was constantly behind, sometimes by as many as 17 draws, and there was no one to help. When COVID hit, things got even worse. I was working 6 12-hour shifts a week, with my 6th shift often turning into a 16-hour day. I was also homeschooling 3.5 kids at home, which left me exhausted and in tears most days. One day, my supervisor asked if I still needed to be shadowed or if I was finally ready to actually do my job. I told her I didn't need shadowing, I needed help. Her response was to send me to draw blood from a baby while I was crying, then take me to the lab director's office. The director told me that if I couldn't keep up, maybe the job wasn't a good fit. I told her that no employee or patient should be treated the way we were, and I walked out. On my way out, I dropped my badge, but I was so frustrated that I ended up throwing it at a computer screen. I filed a formal complaint with the health services director about how I and 3 other trainees were treated, but they claimed my concerns were unfounded without ever interviewing the others. It was a toxic environment, and I'm relieved I left. Story 30. I worked at a factory for a day. The factory made wet wipes. My job was simple. Grab a bag of wet wipes from the conveyor belt, place it in a box, and push the box down a roller to someone who taped it shut and stacked it on a pallet. It was mind-numbingly boring. The manager seemed to take pleasure in making the job worse. He walked around ensuring no one chatted or listened to music. He even laughed about how miserable we were. By the end of the 12-hour shift, he told me, "See you back here in another 12. That's when it hit me. I had just experienced the worst day of my life, and I was expected to return with less than 12 hours to rest. I decided I wasn't coming back. The next day, the head office called me in a panic. I told them the manager had said I wasn't needed, so I made other plans. I hoped they had to shut down the production line, or better yet, that the manager had to cover for me. Either way, I didn't regret leaving for a second. Story 31. This story isn't mine, but involves someone I trained with. At 16, I applied to be an open water lifeguard with a regional park district. To get the job, we had to pass tryouts, including a 500-meter swim under 10 minutes. One guy stood out. He casually finished in 8 minutes, even stopping to chat with the proctor between laps. He was older than most of us, clearly in great shape, and had years of experience working on open water boats. This job should have been a breeze for him. After passing the tests and interviews, we started lifeguard boot camp, which would last for a few months. The first day started at 6 a.m. in total darkness. We were thrown into a freezing lake, rumored to be around 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and had to swim hundreds of meters. The cold was brutal, and most of us spent the rest of the day shivering. This guy and I had been getting along, and I thought we'd stick it out together. But when I finally crawled onto shore, freezing and exhausted, he had already packed up his stuff. All he said was, "Good luck, kid. I don't need this expletive," and walked off. I was left to tell the instructors that he'd quit. Story 32. Freshman year of college, I got my first job at Macy's. I'd been talked into an on-the-spot interview during a hiring event and started in early October. My first shift was an 8-hour day on the sales floor, even though I had zero retail experience. The person training me was also new. It was her second day. Halfway through my shift, I was left to manage an entire section, men's athletic wear, on my own. I was told to call the floor manager if I needed help, but no one explained which manager to call since the phone listed multiple departments. I felt completely overwhelmed. To make matters worse, they scheduled me for a shift during a midterm exam, even though I had made it clear I wasn't available at that time. When I brought it up, they told me it was my responsibility to find someone to cover the shift, despite me not knowing anyone at the store. After that first chaotic shift, I decided I didn't want to work there. A week later, I quit, citing the lack of training and their disregard for my availability. Story 33. I worked at a mall food court sandwich shop for 1 week. During the interview, I mentioned my cashier experience but no cooking experience, and they assured me I'd mostly be on the register. That turned out to be a lie. Red flag #1. Only female employees were allowed to work the register. It was bizarre and completely unexplained. Red flag #2. The manager's son supposedly had a birthday 3 times that week. He was at the interview but never showed up for shifts, and he seemed completely out of it during the interview. Red flag #3. The place was infested with roaches. When the health inspector came, the manager bribed him with free food. The inspector told us the restaurant next door had a literal wall of roaches, but said our place was clean. It wasn't. Red flag #4. On my last shift, an older employee started arguing with the shift manager. It escalated into a physical fight in the back room. The shift manager, a college student, was professional and tried to de-escalate, but it ended in crashing sounds, shouting, and a door slam. The shift manager apologized to us afterward, but I was already done. That night, I texted the head boss to resign. He didn't even remember who I was. Story 34. There's a small convenience store in my town where the owner runs the place himself, only hiring 1 employee at a time. Over the years, I'd occasionally ask if he was hiring, and the answer was always no. Until one day, much to my surprise, he said yes. When I agreed to start the next day, he told me, "Make sure you're neat and presentable." It seemed odd, but I didn't think much of it since I always maintain good hygiene and dress appropriately. The next morning, I barely got through the door before he started yelling. "I told you neat and presentable. What is this?" he said, gesturing to my long, curly hair. I always kept it tied back neatly, but he demanded I put it in a bun or braid. As I started to braid it, he snapped, "Stop playing with your hair and pay attention." From there, it got worse. He yelled at me about stealing, saying he'd catch me if I tried. He refused to let me touch the register until I earned his trust. He said calling out sick or requesting days off would result in immediate termination. He even charged employees 25 cents to use the bathroom. The final straw came when he looked at my availability on the application. I had marked 2 days off each week for personal reasons, but he said, "These 2 days won't work. I need you 6 days a week." At that point, I had subconsciously backed all the way to the door. Realizing this job was a mistake, I turned to leave. When he asked, "Where are you going?" I just shrugged, shook my head, and walked out. No job is worth that kind of treatment. Story 35. Technically, I quit during my first official shift. I was 16, and I'd interviewed for a barback position at an upscale restaurant chain. I was excited because the staff seemed great, and the job sounded perfect for me. After accepting the position, the manager gave me a tour of the kitchen. When we reached the dish pit, a line cook was washing dishes. The manager seemed confused, asking why the line cook was handling the station. He then asked if I could fill in for the dishwasher, who had called in sick. Wanting to make a good impression, I agreed. They gave me checkered pants, a chef's jacket, and a surgeon-style hat. I ran to my car to grab my running shoes, and then I was thrown into one of the hardest shifts I've ever worked. I got slammed with dishes for 5 straight hours, followed by helping clean the kitchen. I didn't leave until midnight. Exhausted but still hopeful, I prepared for my official first shift the next day. The following day, I arrived dressed for the barback job, black dress pants, a button-down shirt, and polished shoes. I felt great. As I passed the office, the manager stopped me saying, "Oh, great, you're here. The dishwasher called in sick again." Once more, they handed me dishwashing gear and sent me to the pit. It was a disaster. Nobody had touched the dishes from lunch service. I asked a waitress what was going on, and she quietly told me that all the dishwashers had quit because the job was meant for 2 people, but management only ever scheduled 1. I powered through the pit as fast as I could, asked for my provided meal, and enjoyed every bite. After finishing, I placed my plate in the washer, got changed, and walked out the door without a word. It was clear the place wasn't for me. Story 36. I took a roofing job one early spring in Minnesota, tasked with helping shingle a 5-story apartment complex. The conditions were terrible. Steep roof pitch, icy patches, and no safety harnesses. As the new guy, I was assigned the worst task, hauling heavy bundles of shingles up ladders across the roof and directly to each roofer. It was exhausting and dangerous. I slipped multiple times on the ice, narrowly avoiding falling off the roof. When I asked for a safety harness, they looked at me like I was crazy. During the break, every single worker lit up and got stoned. They offered me some, but I declined, especially after having already slipped a few times. After lunch, I slipped again and slid about 70% of the way down the roof. Nobody helped me. Instead, they just told me to get back to work. By that point, I'd had enough but decided to finish the day out of responsibility. At the end of the shift, I asked the supervisor how long I'd have to work at minimum wage before earning the advertised $10/hour. He told me I'd need to work twice as hard and shouldn't expect the raise anytime soon. That was the last straw. I handed back the tools they'd given me, didn't even bother asking for pay, and walked away. There was no way I was going to risk my life for that crew. To this day, whenever I drive by those long apartment buildings south of Maple Grove on 494, I think of those madmen roofing without safety gear. Story 37. The one and only job I started and quit the same day was at a small-town thrift store whose proceeds supported a women's shelter. After being in a severe car accident, I needed a job I could handle with one arm, and this seemed perfect. The lady on the phone was lovely, and I was excited to start later that week. I showed up to fill out paperwork at the shelter office before heading to the store. The building was quaint, a typical older thrift shop. Inside, I met my new coworker, a bubbly woman in her mid-30s decked out in leopard print and bangles. She greeted me enthusiastically, but immediately launched into every detail of her life. For the first 2 hours, I learned about her 8 kids, her abusive husband, her heart surgeries, her modeling career, her grandmother's death, you name it. When I finally managed to ask if we were supposed to be doing anything, she gave me a quick rundown of the store and mentioned we'd check out the basement. The basement was a scene straight out of Hoarders. Narrow pathways snaked through mountains of unorganized junk, illuminated by a single dim light bulb. My coworker laughed and said, "We're supposed to organize all this, but that hasn't happened in a while." Back upstairs, I asked how many coworkers we had. She told me it was just us and one other college student who was currently recovering from an incident. When I asked what happened, she casually mentioned that the girl had been attacked and molested on her shift. I was horrified. There were no security cameras, no safety measures, nothing to prevent something like that from happening again. She then dropped another bomb. Customers asking about hats weren't looking for actual hats. Apparently, the last employee sold drugs during her shifts and used hats as a code word. Occasionally, old customers still came in looking for her. Before I could fully process this, the boss from the shelter office showed up unexpectedly. She asked to speak to my coworker privately, leaving me alone at the register. A few minutes later, my coworker returned, looking like she was about to cry. She grabbed her purse, said a quick goodbye, and left. The boss casually told me she'd fired her for mishandling money. I was stunned. The boss then said she'd be closing early and would email me my schedule the next day. That was my breaking point. On my way home, I decided there was no way I'd be going back. The next day, I ignored her phone call and replied to her email, thanking her for the opportunity but declining the position. I cited concerns about safety after hearing about the previous assault. There was no way I was going to run that store by myself for $9/hour, with no security measures and no support. I never looked back. Story 38. In 2009, after being laid off from a well-paying job where I made about $600 a week, I had to take the first job I was offered, a position at Wendy's. Jobs were scarce, and while fast food wasn't my first choice, I respected anyone who worked there to make ends meet. On my first day, I was put on fries by a manager with a bad attitude. I spent 2 hours in the fryer during a busy lunch rush, burning my arms from the hot grease. Every time I asked for help or clarification, the manager just laughed and said things like, "It's not that hard. You just dump the fries and set the timer." He also made snide comments behind my back and even started mocking me, saying, "Do you have sandbags in your pockets? You're slow," as expletive. After 2 hours of this, I politely asked if I could try another station, explaining that my arms were starting to sting and that I wanted to learn more about the job. He refused, telling me, "You're staying on fries because I said so. If you don't like it, too bad," then laughed and made more comments to the other staff. I'd had enough. As I took off my apron and started walking out, the manager rushed over and said with a smirk, "Where do you think you're going? You're on fries for another 2 hours." I handed him my apron and replied, "Actually, you're on fries. I'm out of here. Have fun." He blew up, yelling that I couldn't just leave and wouldn't get paid, but I didn't care. I left with my dignity intact, knowing I wouldn't tolerate disrespect just to keep a job. This experience taught me that I didn't have to put up with mistreatment, and I have a lot of respect for anyone who works in fast food. You all truly are pillars of the community. Story 39. 5 or 6 years ago, I took a job as a vendor for a company that sold novelty items like keychains, lanyards, and emoji-themed stuff at Toys R Us. It was supposed to be an easy side gig. I'd check my online portal for deliveries, go to the store, and stock the items. On my first visit, things felt off immediately. I had no name tag or badge to show I worked there, no logbook to sign in, and no idea who to talk to about getting access to the stockroom. I felt completely lost and out of place. They had told me each visit would only take 2 hours, but I spent nearly 5 hours that day. Just unwrapping everything took ages. Then I had to fill out a confusing survey in the portal with questions that didn't make sense. When I tried calling the helpline for guidance, no one answered. I ended up making up answers for the survey and submitted my timesheet, then sent an email to my hiring contact, asking for someone to clarify the process. Over the next 2 weeks, new deliveries kept popping up in my portal, but no one responded to my email, so I decided to quit due to the lack of communication. I never got paid for that day of work, and about a year later, someone from the company called, asking if I was still handling the stores on my route. Somehow I was still listed as an active employee, even though I'd never done any work beyond that first day. I heard later that the company went out of business. Story 40. I was hired as a logistics manager for a high-end cooking spice company that's popular in upscale grocery stores. As a medically retired Army logistics officer, I was excited to use my skills in a new setting. On my first day, they informed me that my actual position didn't exist yet. It would be available in 6-9 months at their new facility, but until then, I'd be working on the warehouse floor and spending part of each day training my future supervisor in logistics management. Then, when the new position opened, I'd have to apply for it like anyone else. I couldn't help but laugh. I removed my keys and company gear, told them they'd done a great job with the bait and switch, and informed them they could keep the job. I also mentioned I'd be filing complaints with the Better Business Bureau, the local hiring commission, and contacting local representatives about their practices. As they tried to backtrack, I just flipped them a wave over my shoulder and kept walking out. There was no way I was sticking around for that kind of treatment. Story 41. I got hired at Domino's Pizza for $10 an hour, working about 20 hours per week. At first, I thought it would be manageable and allow me time for studying and other commitments. However, when the manager explained the schedule, I realized I'd have to miss my long-standing D&D group at least once a month, possibly more due to staffing issues. That alone was disappointing, but the deal breaker was that I'd have to give up being a den leader for my local Cub Scout pack. As an Eagle Scout, I loved passing on my knowledge and skills to younger scouts. It was an incredibly rewarding experience, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice that for a part-time job with low pay and little fulfillment. I decided the joy I got from teaching others was far more valuable. Fast forward a year and a half. I'm still in college, but now I work as a substitute teacher for a local school district. Although I've stepped back from being a den leader to focus more on my education, I feel much better about the path I'm on. For me, it's more meaningful to give up something you love for something you truly need, rather than for something you think you need. All in all, I'm in a much better place now than I would have been working at Domino's. Story 42. I got a referral to work at a pizza shop Italian restaurant as a dishwasher. When I showed up for the interview, one of the brothers who owned the place immediately pulled me into the kitchen. Without any small talk, he demanded, "How much do you want to make?" I was caught off guard and said I didn't know, which made him angry. He repeated the question, more aggressively this time, and I still didn't have an answer. Now, I had 3 brothers and their dad staring at me like I was wasting their time. Eventually, I stuttered out a number, which they all found hilarious. Then the owner grabbed my hands and dragged me to the sink to show me how they expected the dishes to be washed. He also demonstrated incorrect washing methods, again using my hands, while yelling at me for even hypothetically doing it wrong. At this point, I should mention that everyone in the kitchen was chain-smoking Marlboro Reds. There were lit cigarettes on the edges of tables and every available surface. I was barely 3 minutes into the job and already working, confused about my pay, surrounded by yelling, smoke, and chaos. As I started washing dishes, they continued to correct every little thing I did. Then came the final straw. One of the cooks walked over, stubbed out his cigarette in the sink I was filling, and dropped it into the water. That was it. I dropped what I was holding, threw up my hands, and said, "I'm out!" I bolted for the back door and didn't look back. The food was good. They kept bringing me samples to eat, though I got yelled at for trying to enjoy them. But nothing was worth that level of insanity. Story 43. My first full day at KinderCare was a nightmare. During orientation and a brief half-day of training, everything seemed fine. But when I started my first real shift, I was left alone in a room full of 2-year-olds during nap time. One of the toddlers woke up and needed an asthma breathing treatment. I had no idea how to administer it and no one to ask for help. Apparently, their policy was that the staff-to-child ratio only mattered when the children were awake. So while I wasn't allowed to leave the room to use the restroom earlier, my trainer decided it was fine to leave me alone for her lunch break. Instead of coming back to relieve me, she went to work in the infant room. I was found by someone mopping the floors who got her to return. After lunch, they put me in a room with slightly older toddlers, ages 3, 4, who still needed diapers. One child had stains all over his clothes because he kept reaching into his soiled diaper and wiping it on himself. His diaper was changed, but his parents hadn't left any extra clothes, so he was left wearing the same soiled outfit. I was horrified. The lack of care and oversight was unacceptable. I never returned, and I would never consider sending my own child to KinderCare. Story 44. I didn't even make it to my first shift. A long time ago, I applied to what seemed like a fancy restaurant. I told the owner I'd do any job, and he mentioned he needed a dishwasher because his didn't show up the night before. I said I could start immediately, but there was a catch. He wanted me to do a trial shift that night, unpaid. He also told me I'd need non-slip kitchen shoes. At the time, I was desperate for a job. My bank account was almost empty and my bills were piling up. I agreed, thinking it might lead to steady work. I ran to the nearest shoe store to get the required footwear, but when I saw the $50 price tag, I hesitated. Spending that money would likely put me into overdraft. Standing there in the store, I started thinking, what if I don't get hired? What if he's just using me for free labor tonight? I couldn't shake the feeling, so I said, forget it, and walked out of the store. I never showed up for the shift. Sometimes I wonder what happened that night and if things might have turned out differently if I'd gone. But in the end, I think it all worked out for the best.